Plagiarists, by definition, are liars. And if Matthew Franklin Whittier and his wife Abby were plagiarized, we should be able to find instances in the historical record of their plagiarists lying. And that's what I'm going to do today, is read you some examples, maybe one or two examples for each one. And I will not be able to prove that these are lies. That's way beyond the purview of one of these blog entries. You'll have to get that from my books and my papers. The proof is there. All I'm going to do is read the lies and tell you that they're lies. And what I'd ask you to do is just wrap your mind around the possibility that all of these, everything I'm going to be reading is all lies. Okay? Just see what that would do to your reality, if in fact all of these things are lies, which they are. And again, I've got the proof, but you have to go get it. I can't give that to you in an hour or half an hour, however long this is going to take. But first, I wanted to show you a little treasure that I got in the mail. This is volume 3, the second half of 1832 of the New England Magazine. The editor for this, Joseph T. Buckingham, was someone that Matthew had written for back when he was a boy of 12 and on the next few years when he was just a kid. And Joseph T. Buckingham and his son Edwin had established this magazine in New York City in, I think it was the second half of 1831. Matthew contributed quite a few pieces. But although I know they're his, and I can establish that by style and a number of other indicators, it's a little tough to absolutely prove that they're his. Several of these are in what you might call a science fiction, fantasy, philosophical science fiction genre. Matthew'd been writing in this kind of genres like social satire and science fiction and fantasy all combined. He'd been writing in that genre as of at least 1831 when he was editing the Constellation in New York City. But he wrote 2 or 3 in that genre for the New England Magazine as well. Well, again, it's a little difficult to prove that they're his because of the pseudonyms he used. But here, this one's signed with his star. It's one of the first instances. He started using the star in 1829. This is 1832. It's called The Course of Time, an Allegory. And I have read it completely for one of these video blogs and discussed it. So there's no need for me to go into that. It's in beautiful condition. This hopefully will be a real gem in the museum collection when a little museum is hopefully established for Mathew and Abby's work someday. Beautiful condition. It has a library binding, which is fine with me. I don't care, So it's in beautiful shape. Now let's get started with our liars here. The first thing we're going to go to is Charles Dickens' explanation as to how he wrote A Christmas Carol. This is a letter to Cornelius Conway Felton, dated January 2nd, 1844. And he has sent a copy of A Christmas Carol to this fellow in Boston. And he writes, "Now, if instantly on the receipt of this, you will send a free and independent citizen down to the Cunard Wharf at Boston, you will find that Captain Hewitt of the Britannia steamship, my ship, has a small parcel for Professor Felton of Cambridge. And in that parcel, you will find A Christmas Carol in prose, being a short story of Christmas by Charles Dickens, over which Christmas Carol Charles Dickens wept and laughed and wept again, and excited himself in a most extraordinary manner in the composition, and thinking whereof, he walked about the black streets of London 15 and 20 miles many a night when all the sober folks had gone to bed." That's all a lie, the whole thing. Now, we're going to move forward to May 25, 1858. He has written a letter which it looks as though he wanted it to go public. At any rate, it went public. And he is explaining the reason why he is separated from his wife of many years, who bore him 10 children, if I'm not mistaken, Catherine. And it sounds very nice. It was not nearly so nice. Historians know that now. And then he addresses the horrible rumor that he'd been having an affair with a young woman, an actress named Ellen Ternan, which we now know was actually fact. He did, in fact, have a long time affair with this young woman. And it appears that he tried to get his wife, Catherine, out of the way, put into an insane asylum so that he could carry on this affair. So that's what was really going on. Now listen to this language. Two wicked persons who should have spoken very differently of me in consideration of earnest respect and gratitude have, as I am told, and indeed to my personal knowledge, coupled with this separation, the name of a young lady for whom I have a great attachment and regard. I will not repeat her name. I honor it too much. Upon my soul and honor, there is not on this earth a more virtuous and spotless creature than that young lady. I know her to be innocent and pure and as good as my own dear daughters. Further, I am quite sure that Mrs. Dickens, having received this assurance from me, must now believe it in the respect I know her to have for me, and in the perfect confidence I know her in her better moments to repose in my truthfulness, because he was accusing her of being crazy when she would dare question what she deep down knew was going on. On this head, again, there is not a shadow of doubt or concealment between my children and me. All is open and plain among us, as though we were brothers and sisters. They are perfectly certain that I would not deceive them, and the confidence among us is without a fear. Now, it's one thing to deny something. It's another thing to deny it that way. I don't think I have to really comment on that anymore. The degree of hypocrisy we're talking about. It's this person who just explained how he walked the black streets of London in a state of excitement composing a Christmas carol, which he did not do. All right. Now we're going to move on to a character named Albert Pike, who went on in later life, even though he was born in Massachusetts, to fight as a general in the Civil War for the South. And then he became a 33-degree Mason. I've gone over him before and shown how he not only excused, but basically championed and lauded his habit of plagiarism later on when he wrote for the Masons. Now, in this book, this is called The Essayist, and Abby prompted me to buy this thing. It was hugely expensive before I really knew what was in it, and I went ahead and did it because I was really paying attention to her prompting, and boy, am I glad I did. It has quite a few of Abby's poems. It has Matthew's star-signed reviews in 1832 and 1833, just like he again did for the Tribune, which we'll get into in a minute. This poem, not all of the poems are signed this way, but most of the poems of hers are signed A.P. Her initials were Abby Poyen. So happens that Albert Pike's initials were also A.P. And what I've extrapolated had to have happened is that Abby was attending his class, almost certainly in Newburyport, which was close to their hometown of Haverhill. And she might have been staying with a family there. And she was a student in his class. This is 1830. And he went through her private workbook and plagiarized and stole her poetry, both her personal, deeply personal poetry and her class assignments. This had to have been a class assignment to write in the style of Ode to the Nightingale, probably. This is called Ode to the Mockingbird. And this is Abby's work. I won't read it. It's a magnificent poem. So this is 1832. July edition of The Essayist in 1832. So then, years later, Albert Pike writes to his biographer, and he says, I wrote the poetry which I published in my little book printed by George W. Light. Well, it turns out he was friends with George W. Light, who was the editor of The Essayist. So there's a little connection there. Partly in Santa Fe, partly in the mountains and prairie, and partly immediately on my arrival in Arkansas. The hymns to God, which are actually hymns to the gods, like the Roman gods, as originally published in Willis's Magazine in Boston, which is to say American Monthly, 1830. I'm still hunting a copy of that because it has several of Abby's poems in it, which apparently he submitted. As originally published in Willis's Magazine in Boston, I wrote while keeping school at Fairhaven in the schoolroom during school hours. Well, that's not true. I think pretty much for sure it had to have been in Newburyport, which I think after he was teaching in Fairhaven, he taught in Newburyport. And he didn't compose them. Abby composed them. And then he revised them, probably maybe during school hours, if she didn't know what he was doing up there at the desk, but quite possibly after school hours. The poetry published in The Pearl, which I'm not familiar with, I wrote in 1833 while keeping school, all of it. Now, To the Mockingbird, I wrote a day or two after my marriage. I have written nothing since, nothing of any importance, I mean, nor do I think I ever shall. Says, if I should even collect the scattered leaves and publish what I have written and published, it will be solely to get it together so that I can have it in a volume for my own pleasure. I don't know if I typed that correct. That was in fact done later on. It was put together. I think he put it together for very limited publication, and then his family put together a volume which they published after his death. He was married in 1834. Ode to the Mockingbird was published in 1832. He could not possibly have written it in 1834, but there are two versions of it. There's one version that bears just barely some resemblance to this poem, Ode to the Mockingbird, that Abby wrote. And there's another one that is almost the same poem, but just kind of modified a little bit. So basically, he took the poem and modified it some, and then he completely reworked it. Now, this is called Hymns to the Gods and Other Poems, General Albert Pike. This is the one put out by his family. I'm not sure what the publication date of this is. It's a reprint. This is 1916. Edited by Mrs. Lillian Pike, Room, daughter of the author. So his daughter put this out. But she got the titles swapped. So here we have Ode to the Mockingbird, which is the same title as the one that appears in The Essayist. But this is the heavily revised, completely reworked one. And then later on in this same book is the one that was just barely revised, but she's given it the wrong title, which is To the Mockingbird. So his daughter got it backwards. Technically, you can say that he was counting from the completely reworked version, which he did 2 days after his marriage in 1834. I don't think so. I mean, you can believe whatever you want to, So we're going to leave Albert Pike. There's a lot more there. I'm just touching on this for kind of just to give a feeling of it. Again, just suspend disbelief and wrap your mind around for the time that we're together here, around the possibility that all of these are lies. Everything I'm reading. You have to understand what this does to the historical record. If I'm correct about this, it destroys it. It completely upends it. Okay, so now we're going to go to Edgar Allan Poe. I have recently gone through his philosophy of composition. That is a lie from one end to the other, but it's not the only one. So in 1845, it was mid-1845, he published The Raven in a compilation of poems called The Raven and Other Poems. And it so happens that somebody had noticed that there's one line in The Raven concerning purple curtains, which is almost identical to a line in Elizabeth Barrett, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem, Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which she had published in England in a 2-volume set called Poems the previous year, 1844. And then she published it again and retitled it A Drama of Exile, which is the title of one of the poems, A Drama of Exile and Other Poems, I think it is, in America in 1845. Well, those two poems have almost identical lines, aside from being very similar in style. And the reason is that Matthew wrote both of those poems. In 1842, apparently he was going through a phase of sharing a lot of his unpublished work with the literati, both in America and also in Europe. And a few of those people were unscrupulous and published them as their own work, including Elizabeth Barrett. So that's why that line appears in there. Those purple curtains apparently were very important to Matthew. They symbolized Abby. They were something that belonged to Abby. She was of aristocratic descent. Her father was a marquis. Apparently she had some purple cloth that she liked, or that Matthew liked to get for her. And the velvet, which was expensive, the velvet purple curtain and the Raven and the purple curtains had been Abby's, which is why he put them in there, because it was written as a tribute to her. But Poe had to think fast. because that line is so close. There's obviously some connection. It's obviously not coincidence. It can't be coincidence. So he had to think of something. He can't admit, oh, I stole this from somebody. And then that would implicate Elizabeth Barrett as well, who would also stolen it from the same person, see? So he admitted, you know how liars will admit to a lesser charge in order to avoid the serious charge, see? So he admitted that he had imitated Elizabeth Barrett. And so much so that two of the lines ended up almost identical, which is a real stretch, because this is plagiarism. If he took it from her, it's not admiration, it's plagiarism. And to increase this effect, to cement this idea, he inserted a dedication in this volume, The Raven and Other Poems, to Elizabeth Barrett. And it's in big, bold, small and large. One line will be smaller than another, caps, and it really stands out. And he says, "To the noblest of her sex, to the author of the drama of exile, to Miss Elizabeth Barrett of England, I dedicate this volume with the most enthusiastic admiration and with the most sincere esteem." It's all a lie. The whole thing, there's nothing sincere in that dedication whatsoever. Now, what about Elizabeth Barrett herself? Can we catch her in a lie? She's the worst liar. She's awful as a liar. She's just awful, very amateurish, like a little kid. So she's obvious. She's so obvious that I shouldn't have to say anything. See, this is the deal. This shouldn't be a question of, does the journal want to publish my paper or not? They call it an essay, my paper. Does anybody want to publish my paper or not? Do they believe me or not? Are they offended there should be no question because this is so obvious. But let's get into it a bit. Now, I haven't marked these. I've just got little page markers. Elizabeth Barrett, before she married Robert Browning, had a mentor named Hugh Stuart Boyd. He was older, he was blind, he was a scholar of the classics, and he mentored her, and she would write to him. Well, she wrote to him about how she supposedly wrote this same poem, Lady Geraldine's Courtship. Now, I have to say, Lady Geraldine's Courtship, if you have studied Matthew's life and his work and his courtship with Abby Poyen, it's obviously a very slightly modified representation of his courtship with Abby Poyen when she was 15 and 16. Her father was a marquis. He simply took her and took that relationship, which started as a mentoring relationship because even though she was 4 years younger, she was tutoring him. He was a farm boy who desperately wanted an education, and she had grown up getting a classical European education, and she passed it on to him. And they loved to go out in nature. She was kind of a nature mystic, and she sang beautifully. She was a musical prodigy as well as a literary and poetic prodigy, and she would teach him. And that's what this poem is about. It's just thinly veiled. He's just put the whole thing in England and made Abby into the daughter of an earl in England. That's all. Everything else basically is their literal courtship. So Elizabeth Barrett has to explain to us how it is that she wrote Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which, remember, this is a young man, a poor poet, in love with an aristocratic girl. So she's had to switch sexes. And there's a lot of clues in here that point to Mathew and Abby, which I've gone over in my papers. I remembered that one of these quotes isn't in the book that I have, so I had to go get it and print it out. So here's a letter that Elizabeth Barrett writes to her mentor, Hugh Stuart Boyd, on August 1st, 1844, and she's talking about the demands of her printer, her publisher, Mr. Moxon. She says, "Last Saturday, on its being discovered that my first volume consisted of only 208 pages, and my second of 280 pages, Mr. Moxon uttered a cry of reprehension and wanted to tear away several poems from the end of the second volume and tie them onto the end of the first. I could not and would not hear of this, because I had set my heart on having, quote, deadpan to conclude with. So there was nothing for it but to finish a ballad poem called Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which was lying by me, and I did so by writing, i.e. composing, 140 lines last Saturday. I seemed to be in a dream all day long. Long lines, too, 15 syllables each. So that's her explanation as to how she came to write Lady Geraldine's Courtship, is that her publisher was getting on her about her volumes being of unequal length, and she had something lying around, and in a single day, she wrote this poem in a dream state. See, it's all a lie, the whole thing. Now, there's another one in this volume that I have. This is called Elizabeth Barrett to Mr. Boyd by McCarthy is the author, or the editor. And she's writing once again to Hugh Stuart Boyd. And she's speaking of the feedback that she's getting from people, literati and various literary people. She says, I should tell you, however, that she complains of a general impression of monotony after reading, quote, The Drama of Exile. That's her own poem. And that she prefers upon the whole the smaller poems. Lady Geraldine's Courtship she singles out for praise and says of it that she felt herself, in italics, swept through it. Now it is curious that people in general are pleased with Lady Geraldine, and it is true that I always hear of their being pleased with it with a feeling like a sense of escape, I guess she'd underline that, seeing that some peculiar circumstances attended its composition, I'll guess so. Do not tell anybody. People might and would immediately call me a careless, hasty writer. No, that's not what they would call her. But the last 13 of those printed pages were written, composed and written, she has to add, in one day. It was dangerous, indeed, and might have been fatal speed. When people praise the poem, I always think what stuff it might have been. And that is very natural. She's a horrible liar. It was not natural at all. It was indeed dangerous. And she goes into a state of dissociation when people don't like her own poetry, but like the poetry that she plagiarized. She gets a sense of escape. So she's, I would say, I remember I have a master's in counseling, I would say she's severely neurotic, and she has lost all sense of honesty long ago. So again, just suspend disbelief here. Now we move to Margaret Fuller. Now this is tricky. It's hard to catch Margaret Fuller in a flat-out lie. What happened with her is that Matthew was writing possibly as a ghostwriter for her, possibly as a freelancer for the editor. It's not totally clear what the arrangement was, but he had used a star for years and years. There are book reviews, many of them signed with a star, in The Essayist from 1832 and 1833 that Matthew wrote. So he was just going back to an old pseudonym. This was nothing new for him. And there is one of her letters dated January 15, 1845, in which she had just started working as the literary editor for the New York Tribune. And apparently her Aunt Mary asked her, are you the star? Are you the person writing as the star? And she said yes. Well, this is what happened with the rumor. Later on, there was a rumor that she was the writer of the star, and she acquiesced to the rumor just the way that she acquiesced to her Aunt Mary. So it's a little tough to catch her. I can't get into her letters. You have this like the 3 volumes, and each volume is $100, so it's out of reach for me. But that letter is in one of them. However, let's get into the memoirs written after her tragic death in 1850. And different people wrote different portions. The portion I'm going to read from was written by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was involved in the Transcendentalist magazine, The Dial. He committed to, as I recall, he committed to submit at least something for each edition, quarterly edition. And she was the editor. And we're just going to read this section. This is him talking about, it's under a category of self-esteem. And it means egotism. It means that she was a flagrant egotist, which if she was, it's impossible that she could possibly have written these spiritual reviews and essays that Matthew wrote. Because Matthew was really a mystic. He was a truly spiritual person, and Margaret Fuller was an egotist, which is to say another kind of neurotic. So Ralph Waldo Emerson writes, Margaret at first astonished and repelled us by a complacency that seemed the most assured since the days of Scaliger. I don't know who that is. She spoke in the quietest manner of the girls she had formed, the young men who owed everything to her, the fine companions she had long ago exhausted. In the coolest way, she said to her friends, quote, I now know all the people worth knowing in America, and I find no intellect comparable to my own. I don't think I need to read any more, do I? Our source is impeccable. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's a direct quote. And if that's a direct quote, we pretty much got the picture, right? So I think that's all that I prepared here, isn't it? I think that's all I have. So we'll kind of keep this short now. Yeah, I haven't missed anything. Everything I read for you from each one of these plagiarists was a barefaced lie. Every single one of them. From Dickens to Poe to Elizabeth Barrett, who urged her mentor to keep quiet about it lest somebody thinks she was sloppy, you know. I don't know what it takes, you know, to, I know that I'm tearing down these people's reputation, but Mathew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyens Whittier's legacy is at stake here. So I'm forced into this. Basically, all I care about is to get Mathew and Abby's work away from these people. Once that's done, I don't really care what happens to their reputation, meaning these plagiarists. I don't care what happens to their reputation after that. I'm sure that Mathew and Abby were not the only people that they plagiarized from. And this is Pandora's box. Once you open Pandora's box and you start to see these people that way, see, it's all over, because then you see more. Then you realize that when Griswold criticized Poe, he was right. And when other people charged Charles Dickens with plagiarism, they were right. And so on. See, Pandora's box is opened. But Pandora's box was opened with regard to Charles Dickens already because of this little detail of him trying to get Catherine put into an insane asylum, and the other little detail that he really did have this long-time affair with Ellen Ternan and tried to snow his poor wife, Catherine. And whenever she would get suspicious, he would accuse her of being crazy. See? So I didn't do that. That's already been done before I came on the scene. And there's more with regard to Dickens. I strongly suggest reading all 52 pages of my paper, not essay, on Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. Read the whole thing, because I've just given you one tiny little piece of it here. That's enough. It should be enough. Well, that's all. I'm not getting very many hits on these video entries. I think the last one had, if you don't count duplicates, I think it had 6. And that's not enough. I want to see at least 8 unique people, you know, looking at these. This material is, it's profound. It's profoundly impactful. It's going to require the complete rewriting of 19th century literary history, both American and European. That's how much of an impact Mathew Franklin Whittier was having behind the scenes on his century. It's not my imagination. I can prove it. It's a matter of, are people prepared to have their universe shaken up that much? Because it's going to make everything that's been written on all of these plagiarists immediately obsolete. It's going to all have to be reworked and rethought and reexamined. And then there's the question of, who was Mathew Franklin Whittier? Who was Abby Poyen Whittier? Who was this 20-year-old, 21-year-old woman who wrote the most important aspects of A Christmas Carol and shook the world, moved the world with her story? Who was she? You know? And then you'll find her poetry that was plagiarized and distorted in some cases by Albert Pike. It made him famous. And you'll see her short stories that nobody's ever seen before. And you'll find that Matthew was a child prodigy of 12 when he first started publishing in Joseph T. Buckingham's newspaper, The New England Galaxy, in Boston in 1825. All of this is in my various papers. You can find them in the article section on my website and in Academia EDU. So there's a lot to discover here. People have to get past the shock, and they have to get past the idea that reincarnation is bullshit and that I have to be crazy because I say I'm the reincarnation of Matthew, and that I'm actively in contact with Abby in the astral realm. Now, it may be that it's going to be at 200 years before people are ready for this, but this is all true. I have been speaking the truth as much as I possibly can, as a human being can, since 1973 when I took up that practice. Everything I've said in every one of these entries, unless I've just made a blunder of some kind, which I do occasionally, is the truth. I've told the truth in every single one of these blog entries, including reincarnation and in my papers as well. Unless I've made mistakes unintentionally, all of that is true. So I don't know, at some point you would think that people would realize it. And I'm just waiting. I don't know if it'll be in my lifetime or some other lifetime or how I'm going to preserve this work, because there's a desperate need. If people are not going to recognize that what I'm doing here is genuine, that this work has to be preserved, including, these books like The Essayist. I don't know where you find a copy of this. I mean, it must be extremely rare. The only reason it wasn't so expensive that I couldn't possibly touch it is because nobody knows the value of it, see? But I think it's very rare. I don't know how many copies there are of it. But these things have got to be preserved for the future. So when people do wise up and realize that every single bit of what I'm presenting here is correct, that they'll be able to appreciate it, and that reevaluation process will take place, and the rewriting of 19th century literary history can commence.